Greetings, friends. So I just finished reading this book, The Modern Mercenary, Private Armies and What They Mean for World Order by Sean McFate. Now, Sean McFate worked for a private military company called DynCorp International in Burundi in the early 2000s to protect the president from assassination successfully. And he also worked for them in the early 2000s in Liberia after the bloody Liberian Civil War to help build an army, to raise an army for Liberia from the local population, arguably also successfully. But as you'll see, there are also some very big cons to the private military industry, as he discusses in this book. So the basic message of the book is that we're living in what he calls a neo-medieval world, or a new medieval age. And this is an age where the warfare is increasingly privatized. So the future of war, or the future of warfare, is going to be very privatized. It's going to be subnational actors who are calling the shots, who are having the largest effect on the global stage. States won't go away completely, but they'll become increasingly weak. What we're looking at is a world filled with weak states and weakening states and failed states. So we got to look back in history here, because private military force is actually the norm. So if you go back to the 14th century in Italy, especially northern Italy, that was a very chaotic place because private mercenaries were for hire. War is a profitable business. The mercenaries are more efficient. That's why they exist, and they're often more specialized. So early on, it was mercenaries who were using the first firearms in Europe. They were using the arquebuses and crossbows before that, because it took more expertise in those days to know how to use those weapons. And also the pike. It was the Swiss pikemen who were able to offer their services to fight for whoever. In northern Italy, it wasn't just northern Italy, it was all of Europe and much of the rest of the world. So he uses the term PMC, a private military company. Now that includes what you might be more familiar with as people with guns, mercenaries, but it also includes military enterprisers, as Sean McFate participated with DynCorp in Liberia. They weren't actually fighting, they were raising an army. But if you raise an army, you probably know how to deploy it and command it and conduct warfare as well, as is usually the case, because these mercenary companies throughout history and today, they come often from national armies. Well, maybe not always in the past, but these days they come from national armies. So those are the two distinctions in these PMCs. There's the actual mercenaries, and then there's the enterprisers, although there is some linkage between them, because one can also do the other. One can work in one field in one country and another field in the other country, right? So there's also contractors, of course. We're not talking about just people who supply military bases with food or other supplies. All the other sorts of contracting, like I was talking about Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman in another video, and we wouldn't include those here as private military companies, but they could be in the future. But it's a very broad spectrum. Now the point is that militaries today are. National militaries are less important. It's a neo-medieval world. It's a new medieval age. It's increasingly chaotic, but this chaos, according to Sean McFate, it will be contained. It will be what he calls durable disorder. Now, getting back to the medieval time period, it wasn't always chaotic like you think of the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages. Sure, there was some chaos there, but it tended to get into this equilibrium later on, and there were even very cosmopolitan societies. It depended on where you went in the Mediterranean. But basically the idea is there was no dominant state in those days. And as I criticize the government, that sounds kind of nice to me. But of course there was more chaos back then. And there were different authorities competing with each other constantly, and they often had competing claims for power over the same piece of land. So popes could fight against lords could fight against the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor could fight against the Pope. There could be one pope fighting against another pope, because for a time there was like the pope in Avignon, France, and he was challenging the pope in Rome. Well, there was the Byzantine pope. Well, no, did they have a pope? I don't know. But there was conflict. There was all these different groups, and not just religious orders, but monastic orders could have their own armies. Just all like kings. So I mentioned king, nobles, just all these different actors. Some which could appeal to the moral sphere, like the church. Some which could just appeal to brute force, and it was normal to have mercenaries in those days. And sometimes it was even a respected profession, and Englishmen would go to fight in Italy or other countries. The Swiss pikemen would go and use their superior skills in the pike to fight in northern Italy as well. And again, they were more efficient than the national soldiers, because when you get paid, you're going to do a damn well job, because it's directly concerned to your self-interest. And again, they were often able to decide the outcome of many battles in those days. Now, of course, there's always a downside to having mercenaries, which is that they can turn on you they can make a better deal with the enemy, right? So you can't always rely on them. You have to pay them well. Again, there's an argument he makes in the book for a mediated market. Like in Liberia, there's no other country allowed to bid on the contract to pay DynCorp other than the U.S. government, right? So that's kind of not really a free market. A real free market is Somalia. It is chaotic. It's complete chaos in Somalia. It's a free market for force, and then it basically looks like Italy in the 1300s, with just different warlords fighting each other. But then there's also 3 different sub-countries within Somalia. There's Puntland, and then there's Somaliland, and then there's Somalia. And they're like sub-national governments, but then they're competing with different warlords, and also terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, which controls much of central and southern Somalia. So, correct me, I could be wrong about their territory there, but they're a major actor, and they even challenge Ethiopia and bordering countries. And Al-Shabaab attacked a mall in Nairobi, Kenya, some years back. And the Kenyan government, I don't even think they were able to kill most of the militants. So there's really that parallel. It was really the state system, what he calls the Westphalian system. Many historians trace it to 1648, although it doesn't really, it's just a point in time. It doesn't necessarily exist 1648, but that's when the 30 Years' War ends in Europe, a devastating religious war, arguably, perpetuated by mercenaries and war for profit. And just, when a national government would run out of resources, the war's over, but there's mercenaries from all around. It's an international thing. They can keep the war going as long as someone can pay them. So at the end of that conflict, the Peace of Westphalia was, some see it as the marker to begin the point in history when states would now deal with other states, and only other states. They wouldn't negotiate with terrorists, or sometimes they would, but and that system saw its climax in the 20th century. And basically all it meant is that national governments now had the monopoly of force. Force could no longer be used by subnational actors like nobles or anyone else. They weren't allowed to have their own militias anymore if they weren't sanctioned by the king or by the parliament or what have you. So in some senses, that's a good thing. It can stabilize the situation. It can end a war when the treaty is declared. Not always, but it can end the war and arguably promote economic prosperity and peace and all those things. However, this is my own spin that I'm putting in here. It also has very negative effects, because we wouldn't have the 2 world wars. We wouldn't even have the Napoleonic Wars without the state system existing. No, there's no way so many people would have been drawn into that conflict, and so many innocent people would have to die. So it has its negatives too. But what for better or for worse, that Westphalian system, whether it actually began in 1648 or it never really went away. It's a spectrum between national authority and no national authority. It's just, it's a device for us to think of things geopolitically. But there is something there. But whatever it was, it's not around anymore. Not since 1991, when the Soviet Union officially collapsed. And because that was the ultimate climate pinnacle of the state system, the United States against the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an imbalance in geopolitics, and all of a sudden states started weakening around the world. Yugoslavia collapsed into chaos only a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early mid-90s. There was all that chaos, all that ethnic cleansing. And perhaps you could say those people were fighting for their own states, but it was clearly the collapse of the state of Yugoslavia within the former Soviet bloc. Likewise, in Rwanda, also in the early to mid-90s, there was the Hutu and Tutsi tensions, and then the resulting genocide. How many people died? 800,000 people died. Now here's an interesting moral dilemma. Kofi Annan, the UN, what is he, Secretary General, or he was the face of the UN, the United Nations at that time, an international organization. He was presented with a private military company offered, I forget which one, but they offered to get boots on the ground in 14 days and then have basically a private army within 6 months that could prevent the genocide. But he was like, well, you didn't really want to do that because then you're arming a mercenary group and you're not really, you're not dealing with the state. So he didn't let that happen, and 800,000 people got slaughtered by the UN force that did arrived way too late, and then they basically sat on their asses and got mortars launched into their base and hunkered down. And there's pros and there's cons to this neo-medieval world with these mercenary armies, these private military enterprises, private military companies. The other con, you saw this in northern Italy, and today, is that war is profitable. So sometimes these mercenaries, one side arms itself, then the other side, no, then they better get their mercenaries too. Next thing you know, you have a much more tense situation with more guns in the country, more armed people. So there's a possibility it can escalate tensions. And there's even a possibility that some of these groups will start wars for their own benefit. That's arguably going on in Afghanistan right now. Afghanistan and Iraq aren't the best examples of looking at PMCs, private military companies, because they were mostly national soldiers involved in the beginning, but now it's mostly contractors. In 2003, it would have been 90% U.S. national soldiers, Americans, who were, armed in the country in Iraq. But by 2010, it was like 90% contractors working for companies that the U.S. public won't really hear about, so you won't really hear if they get killed, and a lot of them do get killed, and some of them just build, they participate in construction, they cook food. It's not all like they're carrying weapons around, they're doing all sorts of things. But most of them aren't U.S. citizens. A lot of these PMCs are American companies, but now Russia's having its own companies, South Africa, Britain, probably France, probably Australia. There's all sorts of different companies, not just DynCorp International. You would have heard of Blackwater, which renamed itself after the Nisour Square massacre, where about 17 unarmed Iraqi civilians were shot by former Blackwater employees. No one was prosecuted for that because it didn't occur on U.S. soil, and there's nothing you can do. But that's a good example of the con. It had strategic implications for the United States because it caused an outroar against the U.S. and arguably more U.S. lives would have been lost later because of that outrage, more pressure on U.S. forces because of that massacre. So, but it doesn't really matter because the genie's out of the bottle now, and all sorts of different countries can do this. So they're gonna seek profit. They're gonna often have an interest in fighting, but at the same time, first of all, national militaries states are weak. States are failing. So what do you expect? It's not really like we have a choice. This is just sort of what's going on. And the pros are it's efficient, it gets the job done. And so some oil companies, shipping companies. I mentioned Somalia already, especially the piracy in the sea there. You got so many private military companies operating in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, providing security to shipping, because it's some of the most dangerous waters in the world for piracy. So basically, some of these companies will even fly a helicopter out to your tanker ship or your freighter and land a contingent of armed personnel, and they'll like escort you through the dangerous waters, and then later the helicopter will come pick them up and take them back. Then there's other enterprise, or I shouldn't say enterprisers, because in Somalia it's pretty much, there aren't really any enterprisers building armies there. They're just the private military mercenary groups. But some of them have their own boats and fleets, which will go out and seek out these Somali pirates in the waters and destroy them. And the Somali pirates are themselves like a subnational actor, and they often have motherships that are out in the deep ocean, and then they send out smaller ships to raid these different ships. So it's just a very chaotic environment over there, very different from Liberia. DynCorp was involved in raising an army, training them after the terrible civil war there, and that was mediated by the U.S. government. The U.S. government was paying DynCorp hundreds of millions of dollars, or maybe more than that, to train a new Liberian military, and they had to vet the soldiers to make sure that they hadn't participated in genocide, which was difficult to do. But basically, I mean, it wasn't like a military. It was more like just something to stabilize the country. They only wanted it to be 2,000 men with a maximum of 4,300 men, just to prevent these two rebel groups from starting the war again. Or, I mean, the thing is, and demobilizing the old army, that was a difficult thing to do, because a lot of the old army, the national army, had participated in a lot of the same genocide and might be very wary about giving up their weapons. So DynCorp actually had to pressure the U.S. government. Well, that was their client, but they had to pressure the Liberian government to just make an executive order like the army is now demobilized, rather than a soft option of getting them to voluntarily surrender their weapons and receive a sum. So that was some of the work and arguably Liberia is a success up until now. Maybe things have gotten worse. I haven't paid attention to how it's like today, but a few years ago it was getting better. Now, this neo-medieval world is just where we're at. There's going to be different competing actors. Culture is going to be more important. States are going to be less important. And the international organizations, even like aid organizations, they also employ PMCs. They employ mercenaries to defend them, to guard their workers. In a lot of these countries, aid workers get abducted, they get kidnapped, you have to be ransomed. So and the United Nations itself is an international organization which subcontracts to many different PMCs. And again, so we look at the world in the past 20 years, and it's a remarkably different world than what it looked like during the Cold War. Now, I mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan. It's so chaotic over there because, again, it's a bad situation because especially in Afghanistan, a lot of these there's just so many contractors going on there. It's such a complicated situation. A lot of them are, like I said, playing both sides. They're just local warlords who have organized. I mean, mostly Afghans. Like, again, most of these mercenaries are not. They're not employed from the United States. A lot of it's local, because when these local countries see the U.S. military getting involved, they often copy their model, and now they're doing the same thing. So they'll escort your convoy. They'll take action against the enemy in certain situations, but they might be taking money from the Taliban as well. They might attack the Taliban when the Taliban is really small, but when the Taliban is really big, then they'll cut a deal with them. So basically, I grudgingly welcome this increasingly chaotic world. I don't like any of the increasing warfare and all that stuff, but look how bad the state is. Look at the globalists. It's a moot question. It's a moot point. They're failing anyways. The United Nations could never control the whole world. The European Union is going to collapse. But they have this vision to create a 1984 society, to create a brave new world where one state finally won. I mean, that's the premise of the two books. They're different books, but 1984, Brave New World. both based on the idea that that the state system finally succeeded and one government, one army was able to conquer the whole world. But that's not going to happen. I mean, yes, you have fears. Sure, there could be an elite, there could be an Anunnaki, but for whatever reason, they're serving their own best interests here. Even they don't control the whole world. They're just doing their own thing because, look, the world is chaotic. Yes, there could be some terrible biological weapon released. There could be some terrorist group getting its hand on a nuclear weapon, causing a lot of destruction. But with that increasing fracturing of the world, it's almost like it would be harder for these things to spread around because one system implies a globalized system. But if the world falls apart and it sort of splinters, then also conflicts can be contained. That's why Sean McFate calls it this kind of durable disorder, this ongoing, endless warfare, but not necessarily on this massive scale like you wouldn't see something like World War II ever again. It just wouldn't feasibly happen. So I've rambled on long enough there. Hasta luego, amigos.